A roundup of what's going on in Ukraine. So, apart from the extraordinary spectacle of the Vladimir Putin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, being asked about Yevgeny Prigozhin's activities and his admission last month that he played a major role in creating the Wagner private military mercenary group that played such an important role in establishing a foothold in the Donetsk region. He said, well, no comment. No comment. He's not prepared to be drawn on whether Prigozhin is actually the founder or the bankroller of this private military mercenary group. And that's neither here nor there in a sense as far as he's concerned. He just doesn't want to discuss that private group. And I suspect he doesn't want to get into any discussion about whether prisoners are now involved in fighting or being trained to fight in Ukraine and what terms they are under, whether murderers and rapists and people who are potentially prisoners of conscience are now fighting in the Russian colours in Ukraine, or going to. That's one thing. The other thing is that Mr. Zelensky is clearly presiding over a major set of victories. So in all the four regions that President Putin annexed the other day, Zelensky is making headway in all four regions. And so much so that the Russian soldiers, rather than surrendering, are simply running away. Why? Because they don't want to be accused of the atrocities that they're leaving behind, because they clearly don't want to surrender, because they will then get into further trouble, presumably by the Russian side should they return in some form to Russia, and they fear that they fear the propaganda stories about how they might be abused by Ukrainians. Of course, that's highly unlikely. They will be held and treated under the Geneva Conventions. But that's not what they've been told. They've been fed the most alarming stories. And so they're fleeing, and they're leaving their tanks, and they're leaving their weapons behind. And so the Russian army, which we know is very under-equipped, has now just mobilized this huge force of young men, those who didn't manage to escape to other countries or to the border or go into hiding in the main territory of Russia. And there simply isn't enough equipment for them. There aren't enough uniforms for them. There aren't actually enough shoes for them. This is a completely ill-equipped system. And at the same time, the army based in Ukraine, when it's being attacked, is leaving all its stuff behind. So further potentially equipping the Ukrainian side and further denuding the Russian side. Putin is saying things will stabilize. Things will stabilize, but not in his favor. The question now is whether Putin tries to define the border between his land grab and Ukraine proper, or whether he's pushed back even more, and what this is going to do about morale across the Russian troops. We also know, for example, that Ukrainians who have been caught up in the land-grabbed areas are now having great difficulty getting out. They actually need some sort of visa to leave their own state and to go into the rest of Ukraine. So families are now split up. There's the equivalent, I suppose, of a sort of Berlin Wall developing, and we'll see how that is erected and what form that takes. But I can imagine that will take up a lot of Putin's effort in the next few weeks. And if he's occupied with that, then maybe he's no longer occupied with his threats to rain missiles down on Ukraine and to use other satanic armament. Let's hope. Let's hope he's distracted.